Because chapter 10 is the longest chapter of the book. The longest chapter of the book. We are splitting that into 3 sections so you can appreciate each part of chapter 10. Chapter 10 is about the origins of the state, looking for where the state is. And this is, I guess chapter 10 is so long because this has been such a huge issue in the social sciences, and people always looking for the origins of the state. It's kind of like people looking for the origins of language, the origins of humans, the origins of things. Whenever you're looking for the origins, you have to take those with a grain of salt or be kind of suspicious, because usually origin stories are not what they seem. The reason people go looking for the origins of the state is probably because we all live in something like a state today. We all live in places where our lives are bureaucratically controlled. We're not supposed to use violence on other people because that's what the state is supposed to do if they want to, etc. We all know what borders are, and we have passports and those kinds of things. We have to cross them. And we also can look back in time and say, aha, those people in the Aztecs or the Incas, that looks like a state too. That's where they're using state control of violence, and they have a military and a bureaucracy. So maybe that's like what we are today. And so, of course, it does seem to lead to the natural question, when did it happen? When did it happen that these early states, these formations that rise and fall, how does it happen that now we all have to live under the shadow of the state, as some theorists have famously put it? We've come to live, I forget who said that, I'll have to look it up, that we live more and more under the shadow of the state. However, Graeber and Wengrow are going to tell us that this is, in fact, a fool's errand, something you send a fool to do. You go off and say, find the origins of the state, quick. And they say it's very much like what they were also trying to do, or they began the book doing, looking for the origins of inequality. When did it all happen? And the reason they say it's a fool's errand is because there isn't really some sort of magical switchover point. It's not that like suddenly people were all of a sudden living under a state and life completely changed. And as we saw, different states kind of rise and fall and come in and out of the picture. And then there's the issue that a lot of this is simply projecting our own situation and saying, aha, we all live in states, or we all have language, or we have gender inequality, and we're going to figure out where that happened. So we go searching for it in some remote place in the past. But what we're really doing is taking our own condition and putting it back onto the past and acting like people were exactly the same as us. Or that they were on some sort of road to becoming us, and they couldn't deviate from that road. They were already on the path. So again, they are in this chapter trying to get us away from this idea that what we're looking for is an origin of the state, as if it were the explanation for everything that had happened to us. We run into another problem when we're looking at this, Cyrus, which is, well, what's our problem with this whole state thing? What if I tell you, Cyrus, to go look for the definition, look for the origin of the state, where go find it? Different definitions. What even is a state? There's been all these different definitions of what it is. One of the most famous definitions, which I'm sure you remember back from class number 3. You don't have to write this down because it's already in your notes. I'm sure that Felicia remembers talking about the Hobbesian trap and the Yanomamo. Oh, yeah. Wow, good. All right. So I gave you this definition, which is a very famous definition that sovereign states, each with a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence within its borders, which comes to us from Max Weber, a lecture he gave in 1918. It's been used ever since. So the idea is that, remember, Hobbes was the one who believed that we needed a Leviathan. If we didn't have a strong government, then we would result in a war of all against all, and that nature was every man against every man. That's the Hobbesian trap, that one person does something and then somebody retaliates. And if you don't have to have the state to step in and clamp down on them, then you'll end up in this tit for tat violence exchange. And so Hobbesians love state governments, as does Steven Pinker. Anyway, back to that earlier idea, which came to us from Max Weber, that only the state has the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. So this has been, again, a very persuasive definition. The monopoly on coercive force or use of violence in a territory, they're the ones that have legitimate use over that. In this chapter, though, they tell us that it is usually associated with Max Weber, but the real source of this was this other person who seems to spell his name differently depending on which version of German you use. This was a kind of a rabbit hole for me. I was trying to figure out who this person was, never heard of him. Somebody said he was the Mark Twain of German jurisprudence, which would be a pretty big deal, I guess, because I think I know about Mark Twain, but boy, I've never heard of Rudolf von Jhering. Apparently, he was a brilliant guy, and apparently Weber did get some stuff from him, but if you look back, I cannot find where he actually said this, at least on first blush. But we'll say he was apparently a smart but tragic figure. Anyway, that's a small rabbit hole which will not go down because we don't need a Mark Twain here. We already have our own Mark Twain. Well, they can have theirs. German jurisprudence. Anyway. The problem that Graeber and Wengrow say is that this definition does not really work for the early states. They did never, even if they claimed to have exclusive control over violence, it wasn't very absolute. Their claims to it were kind of like, what did they say? They had a good one. They said that for most of human history, rulers either didn't make such grandiose claims, or if they did, their claims to a monopoly on coercive force held about the same status as their claims to control the tides or the weather. So it's like, yes, I am the king, I control the tides, but they don't really. And neither do they control the coercive force or violence in a territory. I would also say it probably doesn't describe us very well either in the United States. A lot of people do not trust the state to have a coercive and have the monopoly on coercive force or violence. We tend to try to take that into our own hands a lot. So yeah, this doesn't really work very well for, it seems to only work for a few European states and maybe Japan, where they definitely keep people from hurting each other. Anyway. The Marxists came up with another definition, is basically that the state arises to protect the wealth of the ruling class and keep class exploitation going along and humming smoothly, to keep all the little people working for the big people, and so that's why you have a police. Now, they don't really go into this too much. I guess I would summarize by saying that the Marxists, or at least the crude Marxists, this is just a very kind of ham-handed definition. And so whenever you have one person exploiting another person, which is sometimes hard to figure out, you'd say, aha, the state is here. And it just doesn't work very well. It also completely eliminates the possibility that states could be used for something other than exploitation, which we'd like to believe. So we've now kind of fallen back on the idea that a state is necessary to coordinate a large and complex society. That whenever you have a lot of people trying to do something, you're going to have to need somebody to tell them what to do and to order them and to make them show up on time and to give them grades and to make sure their papers are in. So you need somebody to coordinate these complex societies, make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. Graeber and Wengrow say that one of the problems with this is it's a completely circular argument. So that every time you see complexity, you say, aha, there must be a state. Every time you see a state, there must be complexity. So it doesn't really tell us much about human organization. It also, as we saw in the last two chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9, it does not seem to apply to the early cities, those places where people were able to organize without necessarily having hierarchical and authoritarian arrangements. Those things seem to have come more often in small-scale societies on the outside of the cities, not in these cities. So, I mean, they've already kind of gone through this. It can't just be complexity. Instead, they break this down into what they are looking for as three components of domination. The first component, or the first thing that people talk about, which we've been talking about with that classic definition of the state, is who controls, who has legitimate control over violence. And one of the places that comes out is in the situation of having control over land or having control over your property. Graeber and Wengrow say that when we own a piece of land or own a house, we have a title and a deed. And how do we make sure that it's ours? They say that it is maintained by a subtle mix of morality. So you're not supposed to come and squat on my land if I own it. That's just, you're not supposed to do that. And the threat of violence, that I can call somebody up and get you removed from my land if you're squatting on it, and get you removed from my house. You shouldn't be able to stay there. Now, in some places, actually in many states of the United States, this results in something known as the castle doctrine, which is my house is my castle. And if I feel under threat in my house, I am legitimately entitled to do whatever I want to the person who is causing this threat. I do not have to retreat. Fire. Has this come up recently? A lot. A lot. It's at least two. At least two recent cases where, again, we think of these things as somehow in the abstract legal definition and Max Weber and some German guy, the Mark Twain of German jurisprudence, but it actually is pretty intensely related to something that is going on right now. You know, as we know, this poor boy goes up to the wrong door, rings the bell, and gets shot. Unbelievable. I mean, but, you know, the person has pleaded not guilty because says, felt scared. Ugh. But yeah, there's these laws, the stand your ground law, the castle doctrine. Now, it's not supposed to be for people who ring your door. You actually do not have the right to shoot somebody just because they ring their doorbell. That doesn't apply. However, that's what he's going to try and claim. That's what he's going to try and say. So there it is, maintained by the threat of violence. And like I said, in our country, we don't just leave this to the state. We take it into our own hands. Another case closer to here is this poor girl who was, you know, driving to what they thought was a party, 20 years old, realized they're in the wrong road, turned around and gets blasted and dies. Again, you're not supposed to shoot somebody just because they're like in your driveway. Admittedly, it was a long driveway, but you're not supposed to. But yeah, he's going to claim the same thing, right? Blah, 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 under blah, blah. Anyway, weird country, huh? Yeah, I think there was another one where this was different though. A couple people, girls got into the wrong car accidentally, left, and then anyway. Again, this idea that you have ownership over your stuff and that anybody that comes in there is a legitimate target of violence is some pretty weird stuff. But it does go with this idea that property ownership is about control of violence. They then go into a second example, which involves Kim Kardashian for several pages. Several pages they spend on Kim Kardashian and her diamonds, which I was kind of confused by. I thought, what is this strange obsession with Kim Kardashian and her diamonds and walking around Paris and stuff? I don't know if any of you were also confused. I don't know if you remember, though, when I looked up what happened to Kim Kardashian, it is true that, in fact, when she was in Paris, she was robbed of about $10 million in jewelry at gunpoint. I think it was actually in her hotel room, as I've come to learn. And so this is actually a picture of her dripping diamonds, but now she's got extra people with her to make sure they don't disappear, because you need the threat of violence to maintain your personal property. So I guess they did have a reason for using Kim Kardashian. At first I was very confused, but now I know. It was actually probably when they were writing the book, it was front of mind. So here she goes, dripping diamonds. I want to be dripping diamonds. Anyway. Why would I want to drip diamonds? I don't know. Wait, you don't like New York City, so I'm not sure. Does anybody else want to drip diamonds?
No.
Duh, yeah, thank you. So then they go through several thought experiments and say, what if nobody had extra security? Could Kim Kardashian keep her diamonds? And they say she could if she has control of information. So if she can put her diamonds away in a safe, and only she has the combination to that safe, if she has that, then she can hold on to the diamonds even if everybody is equally powerful. Yes.
Is this also the control of knowledge?
Control of knowledge, yeah. Bureaucratic, yeah, I mean, they're going to extend it on to bureaucratic knowledge and being able to maintain a secret. So that's a second characteristic, the control of information, the control of knowledge. Our third characteristic is individual charisma. So they then go through this thought experiment of what if everybody can't tell a secret or can't keep a secret? Not sure how that would work, but then Kim Kardashian would just have to convince us that she was a special person and deserved those diamonds. And so we let her keep them because she was so awesome. I was trying to think about this individual charisma thing for a while and think about who is the most charismatic person in the world. And do we give that person special status because of their great charisma? Huh? Yeah, I mean, I
think they're mostly like very popular.
Yeah, I mean, and you had mentioned that it was Hitler's birthday yesterday. I mean, they're seen as being these kind of people who had, I don't know, though. I'm not sure about that. Boy, after mentioning those people, I hate to put this picture up. I think we'll just go into the modern age. But I think that, I mean, for me, I think, and I'm not trying to say anything political here, but, Barack Obama still has a pretty extraordinary charismatic rise, right? I mean, he was in politics for a short period of time, and then all of a sudden he's the president. I'm not saying he didn't work hard, but boy, it was fast, and he was young. I mean, he's still young, like just turned 60. So, he's a still pretty young person who rose fast. And if you compare him with Joe Biden, Biden ran for president like 3 or 4 times and was in the Senate for like 30 years, maybe more. Had to work all that time, run a few times. Barack Obama, he just runs one time and gets it. So JFK, yeah, I think we could put up JFK as a very charismatic person. Yeah. I was thinking about this guy though. I think he's still the richest man in the world right now. I think so. No, this is Elon Musk. Yeah, Bezos, we could put his picture up too. Yeah, right. Bezos, we could put his picture like a before and after. I wonder about these guys though, because it seems like to me they're not very charismatic. They just use their money to buy charisma. I mean, if you look at where Jeff Bezos went, like if you look at him back before he was Jeff Bezos, he was just this nerdy guy. And he just keeps getting more and more charismatic and more built and buffed as he gets richer and richer. Yeah, and it seems like Elon Musk, at least from my point of view, seems to be just buying whatever. He wants us to believe he's charismatic. I hate to hit him while he's down. Apparently his SpaceX rocket just blew up a few minutes ago. So, but huh? Yeah, the space. I just read that on the news. They finally launched it off and then it exploded. Fortunately, I guess it was just an experiment. So good try, they say. Anyway, sometimes the argument of charisma becomes a bit circular. When I look for the 20 most charismatic people in the world, it turned out to be people who are already powerful. So is it because they're charismatic that they become powerful, or because they're powerful that we're like, ooh, I like that guy, he's got a lot of charisma, he's already powerful? Anyway, we'll see. Okay, so their idea is that the modern state combines these characteristics, and so we see them as going together. On the one hand, a modern state has sovereignty over a territory over which it controls the legitimate violence within the territory. Combining that information, the control of information or knowledge or state secrets within a bureaucracy. They then turn us back to popular culture. 007, the British secret agent, and his license to kill. I think that might even be British spelling there. James Bond, right? So he is a person who has a license, a permission from the government to kill the people he needs to, and is also supported by a massive state bureaucracy that gives him these weapons and transit and all those things. Now, a modern state is also supposed to have a competitive political field. So the reason we are okay with James Bond being having this license to kill, or we think we're okay with it, is because he is supposed to be, in the last instance, controlled by a democracy, controlled by the people who elect their leaders and then devolve authority. He is not supposed to be under a dictatorship because we can elect our leaders. Cyrus, you were looking at me like I'm crazy. You don't think we live in a competitive political field like a democracy? Yeah, they too say that we call this democracy, the competitive political field, but it really isn't too competitive. In fact, it's more like a sporting event where you have two sides and you're on one side and you're just going to fight the other side no matter what they say or do, you're against the other side. So yes, that is basically, I think their description of politics probably resonates with many of us today, where they say that democracy, as we have come to know it, is effectively a game of winners and losers played out among larger-than-life individuals, with the rest of us reduced largely to onlookers. So you have all these, yeah, I think that we all probably can relate to this. And in fact, that's what they're saying from the polls that if you ask most people in the country, they would say something like 70% don't want Biden to run and also don't want Trump to run. However, there's a very high probability that both of these people will be in a runoff in the next election. The same thing. Very high probability. And I don't know, as bad as that is, I probably
It's gonna die soon.
Oh, yeah.
Just give up.
they should just give up. There are many people who should just give up. They're not the only ones, but there they are. And nobody wants it. Well, yeah, here we are. Like I said, the rest of us are reduced largely to onlookers. So I don't know, you can get out there and do something about it. You can try, but it's hard. There they are. That's apparently where we are. All right. So let's get back to the real issue at hand, which is you have these three elements. You have administration, sovereignty, charismatic politics, or maybe I mixed them up. Sovereignty, administration, charismatic politics. Anyway, we can mix them up because what they're trying to say is there's not necessarily a progression where you automatically start with one and then you add on the next and then you get to the next. And also, they don't necessarily come together as a package. It's not like you have to combine them and they will inevitably combine, and that's where we got. Again, this idea that there is an origin of the state is the idea that these things all came together at once, and then after that, we're all doomed. So, what they're trying to do is tell us that these three things can actually be quite separate. So to do that, they're going to go back and take a look at some of the early states. They start with the good old Aztecs. Right, Matt? The Aztecs. What do we know about those Aztecs? Who are those guys?
They were probably one of the more advanced civilizations in South America and not just Central Mesoamerica.
Central Mesoamerica, yeah. One of the most advanced. And what are those guys doing? Those are warriors, apparently. I don't read my archaeology very well, but yes, this is a very warlike aristocracy. And as we talked about in the last class, their claim to power, the Aztec Triple Alliance, is based on being able to go and defeat other people and take them for tribute. Now, the Spaniards got very upset about they said they were upset about the skulls and the human sacrifice and said it was all Satan and the devil, and that justified them conquering. But really, the Spaniards kind of recognized that this was a very familiar form of governance for them because it was pretty much like what the Spaniards were doing. They'd have a king and put these lower people in charge and collect tax and go conquer some more territory. So they were pretty familiar with this system as they went in. So they got upset about the human sacrifice for sure, which is pretty gruesome, but in many senses, they were very much in line with what the Spaniards were doing. Now, the Aztecs were pretty cool, but the Inca Empire was even bigger and more administratively exciting. They were known as very good bureaucrats and administrators. Interesting thing, this is South America, the South American Andes. The first thing about the Inca, which is super interesting, is that the Inca centers of power in their big cities are up in the mountains. And in most societies, the mountains are where you go to get away from the big cities, and you get away from the state, and you get away and you go hide out in the mountains. But in the Inca world, the mountains are where all the power comes from. And it was the quipu, or the knotted strings that you see pictured here, were critical for the bureaucracy and keeping account of what was going on. This is a fairly ancient Andean system. Some people think it is actually a form of three-dimensional writing that is not just math, but it is a kind of, it can be a storytelling device. Hard to tell though, because the Spaniards eventually burned many quipu and said they were bad. Anyway, the point though, or one of the points, is that both the Aztec and the Inca were these empires that were militarily organized and had these very clear centers of power and centers of command. So in some ways, once the Spaniards were able to recruit people like the Tlaxcala allies, or in the case of Pizarro among the Inca, they were fighting out a civil war. There were a lot of people that hated the Aztecs or hated the Inca and wanted to get on the side of the Spanish in order to settle some old scores. And so the Spanish were able to recruit these people. And then once you toppled the king, once you sort of toppled the main center, then the rest of the empire falls into place and you have your people already in line for you. So in a sense, these two big empires were also the easiest, or the most easy once you conquered them. In the last class, we talked about, for example, the 40-year war against the Chichimecs to the north, which was long after the whole place had supposedly fallen to the Spanish. It took them another 40 years, and in fact, they never really won that war. So in places where things got more complicated, where they didn't have these empires and kings and state formation like the Aztecs and Inca, it was actually a much more difficult operation. We can also say the same thing about the Maya. So the Maya were once, as we read, organized in this very hierarchical, king-like society, but by the time of the Spanish, they were much more dispersed, much more decentralized, and in fact, it took a very long time for them to finally be subdued. Some people would say that they were never actually conquered, or that there have been rebel holdouts up until almost the present day. So the Maya are a different example. What do you think of this Maya artwork? Huh?
It's a good as my today.
Yeah, I know. That's why I wanted Gabe to evaluate this artwork. How about, we're not good at evaluating. Would we give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Thumbs up. Yeah, this is a good one. And in fact, they say that this, I think this is from the classic. The classic Maya artistic tradition is magnificent. One of the greatest the world has ever seen. That is awesome, right? I would love to go into a museum and see that. Huh? Yeah, you have to, I'm not very good at seeing these things, but it's pretty cool. How about this one? This is also from the Maya. What do you think of this one? Mural. Colorful. Yeah. How's that look? Thumbs up or thumbs down? I don't know. Yeah, it looks, so this is actually from what they call the post-classic Maya period, because it's not classic, it's after the classics. This is when they were in got decentralized. It just turned out anybody to draw things. And some people describe this as clumsy. Yeah. Often seem clumsy and less worthy of appreciation. You don't put this in the museum because it's like, eh. On the other hand, how many of us would really prefer to live under the arbitrary power of a petty warlord who, for all his patronage of fine arts, counts tearing the hearts out of living human bodies among his most significant accomplishments? So the question is, would you rather live in a world in which you have clumsy art, or would you rather have this, but you're governed by somebody who loves tearing out human hearts, but he does like to support artists? Guess it depends whether you're the artist whether you're the king or whether you're just a person. Yeah, exactly. There you go. This brings us to what they call a digression, but I found it to be one of the most interesting parts of this, at least for me. The idea that, and this comes to us, they endnote this shape of time. It comes to us from a book by George Kubler back in the 1960s, which I read on Amazon. People were like, it's still good, still good. Remarks on the history of things. Felicia, what do we often think about time? How do we often characterize the shape of time? When I talk about the post-classic Maya, yeah.
Here, and Wengrow was saying that we should stop using the term post and proto, intermediate, or even terminal, because it encourages like us readers to see history as a teleological series of like progression towards an inevitable end.
Yeah, so we often have these terms like, oh yeah, this is the pre-dynastic era, as if the people living there were just kind of waiting it out until the kings came along, just kind of living in the pre-time, the pre-agricultural period, it's like, well, hey, they had their own lives, they were doing their own things, or we're in the post-Maya, we're in the post-classic, we're just in decline. And so we have these ideas that civilizations come up, and we often throw this word around, collapse. In fact, Jared Diamond wrote a whole book called Collapse. And, we throw all these examples together. Does that mean a political collapse, a population collapse? We often group various things under it. Now, they say that Alfred Kroeber, a very famous anthropologist, the first PhD in the United States given by Boas for a dissertation that was only, I think, 26 pages long, so you have hope. Anyway, he spent much of his life trying to figure out cultures had these patterns to them in terms of, did they grow, did they decline? Wrote a whole book called Configurations of Cultural Growth. Unfortunately, he spent most of his life on it and figured out that he couldn't find any patterns or laws, or things just seemed to go on their own way, willy-nilly. Now, this can also be illustrated to us from good old ancient Egypt, right, Felicia?
Yes.
Yeah. When's the best time to live in Egypt? Yeah. You want to be there for making the good stuff. At least we say. In fact, there's the idea that there was an early kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a late kingdom. It wasn't like the people in these times, or even afterward, were saying, I think we're in the middle kingdom, right? They had no, and so this is a creation of like people about 100 years ago who are trying to classify things and put shape upon time. And as they say, people love this book, the story of Sinuhe. People get all into it. It's a great tale. It's a great book to read. The story of Sinuhe and the proliferation of Osiris cults likely offered little solace to the thousands of military conscripts, forced laborers, and persecuted minorities of the time, many of whose grandparents were living quite peaceful lives in the preceding Dark Ages. So what they're saying is, yeah, we have some great literature, maybe it's kind of like Teotihuacan. We love climbing around on the big pyramids, but those are the things that resulted from, people having to do all this forced labor and stuff. We don't get too excited about walking around a residential or a housing complex. So often from the perspective of museums and art history and our time and literature, we look at these great periods of time when there's these great artists and great things that they made. But in fact, if you were living during the time, that might not have been what you wanted to prioritize. They say that what they say about time also applies to space, in that we often think about the world as just being dominated by these empires or by these cities. And I would kind of illustrate by thinking about, for example, the extent of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire at its biggest point, which is around 1790. And I mean, it is rather amazing that these two very small, little tiny places on the Iberian Peninsula of Europe end up having a transoceanic empire. And in the case of Spain, it stretches from south of what is now Argentina, up through here, all the way up to they controlled even up to what is now Alaska. And almost all of what is now the United States was under Spanish control or Spanish claim for most of its existence. Now, on the one hand, this is rather incredible, and we should note that it's rather amazing. At the same time, a lot of the time, the places where the Spanish actually held control were only these little tiny places like the cities and a small stretch of territory. And in the larger places, it was, you know, what we would call, what some people call tribes, or as they say, segmentary societies. So even though the Portuguese said that they controlled Brazil, they really did not have much say over what was going on in much of the Amazon and other places. And the same thing in South America. And as we talked about in Mexico, they would control Mexico City, but that didn't mean they were in control of everything that was happening to the north. So again, this was a kind of a detour, but it tells us about how we need to think about perhaps time and space in a different way, not from this perspective of, you know, the empire perspective, you might say, or the big what was produced by them. So with that, they revisit some of the early precursors, what people consider to be precursors to the Aztec or to the Inca, starting with the Olmec in Central America. Cyrus, what do you think about when I say Olmec?
Well, it's, I mean, like, you've argued if it's a state or not, and then there's like, also like, these like characteristics that, like saying it's like you find characteristic in archaeological evidence that like people are controlling force, but hard to find evidence for other stuff.
Hard to find evidence for other stuff. There's a lot of arguments about what exactly they were. But what is the first thing that comes to mind whenever we say Olmecs? What pops into our heads? The big heads. The big heads pop into our heads. These enormous, colossal heads. Look at those little kids in awe of the heads. I mean, there's a lot of these too. These must have taken so long to make. And other Matt is not here to tell us that if you look closely, that guy is like a ball player with a helmet on, you know, playing this ball game. Pretty amazing. And you'd think that they might have had a state in order to make all these heads. But what they argue is that this is an example of a society that had enormous, like a sporting charisma, but they really didn't have a great, you know, they weren't going to, I mean, they might have fought somebody, but they didn't have a bureaucracy. They didn't really have a state. There's not much evidence of warfare, but they have these ball games, and it would be great to be immortalized as a big head like that. I guess. That would be awesome.
You're a pod, yeah.
No, it's just a head. You got, I don't know. This is crazy. So that's one of the places. And then we have the civilization of Chavin in South America. Liz, what does that mean? That art picture, what is it? Huh? Yeah, but I'm trying to get Liz to tell me what the story is behind it.
Can't really know for sure.
No, you can't know. That's a problem with archaeology. You dig up something like this, you have some really bizarre art, which was probably used to tell stories and to memorize things, but you can't know what the story is. But you can look at it and see kind of weird stuff going on. It seems like what people said is this is the place where we went to get knowledge and do drugs and go on shamanic journeys. And they don't seem to, again, have a bureaucracy or administration, but they did make this place where everybody would go and, like, you know, get really into the mysticism of the place. It also has some crazy architecture. Apparently there's these mazes and different places, and they'd be doing these hallucinogenics. And you'd also have, I was looking at this, not only are you kind of squeezing yourself through this maze and you're all high on drugs, but also they're using sound to like echo off the walls and give you like sound effects as you're going through this trial. So pretty intense, man. Don't try this at home. Don't try to recreate it. So Graeber and Wengrow say that these are examples of what they call first order regimes, because they seem to be organized around one of the three elementary forms of domination. So in the case of Chavin, we have knowledge control, information control, esoteric spiritual knowledge, but they don't seem to care much about charisma, personal charisma, or they don't seem to care much about controlling violence. In the case of the Olmec, you have this charismatic ball player politics with their big heads, but again, they don't seem to care much about violence or about secret knowledge. And so at the end of this segment of the chapter, they ask the question. So we have one society, we have examples of societies that try to control knowledge, but leave the other two out. And we have an example of society that tries to control charismatic political field, but leaves the other two out. Are there any societies that try to monopolize violence, but don't really care so much about knowledge or charisma politics? What do you think? Sure. Yeah. In fact, they say there are quite a lot of examples. So we're going to start reading about one of them, which is the Natchez. That's the next part, is a society, but there's a lot of them, that tries to monopolize violence, but doesn't so much give a damn whether they're controlling knowledge or charisma politics. In fact, I think there might be a lot of societies like that, right? Maybe the people who only do the drugs and don't care about the violence, that might be a minority. That might be better if we did that.